Marico Man from The Illustrated Bosman by Herman Bosman. We were talking about the fossil remains discovered in a gully of the Malopo by Dr. von Below, the noted paleontologist. Dr. von Below claimed that what he had found were the remains of the first man, and it was going to do us on this side of the Dwarsberge a lot of good, we said, especially as Dr. von Below had paid us the compliment of naming his discovery the Marico Man. The distinguished professor had already given a talk over the wireless about the Marico Man that Atno Deer had listened into. And the schoolmaster, young Vermaak, had read an article on the Marico Man in a scientific magazine to which he subscribed. The professor made his find using just the simplest tools you can think of, Atno Deer informed us. Just a simple digging stick and a plain hand axe. Sounds like the professor is a bit of a Stone Age relic himself, the schoolmaster observed. Using that kind of tools. Nobody laughed. The important thing, the schoolmaster added, when his joke hadn't gone over, was that as a result of this discovery, the Marico Man would now take his place alongside the Piltdown Man and the Neanderthal Man all over the world in scientific circles, where the question as to who was the first man on earth was being discussed. It was an inspiring thought that the Groot Marico was the ancestral home of the human race. That here in the Dwarsberge, the first man, millions of years ago, lower than any savage, started painfully on his upward progress, the schoolmaster said. Yuri Stein said that, speaking for himself, he wasn't too keen on that lower than any savage part, especially as the professor had decided to call his discovery the Marico Man, Yuri Stein said, with a quick wink at Chris Velman that the schoolmaster did not intercept. Yes, that's true, Chris Velman said, coughing, and also shutting and opening his left eye, too quick for the schoolmaster to see. I must say, I don't fancy it either, calling an ignorant creature like that the Marico Man. It's that sort of thing that gives us Marico farmers a bad name. And we don't want any worse name than we already have, Chris Velman reckoned. And look now what it says about the professor finding the Marico Man's remains in a ditch, Yuri Stein continued, almost spluttering at the thought of the way he and Chris Velman were pulling young Vermaak's leg. Right away, people will start thinking we're so low here that when a person dies, his relatives don't give him a proper Christian burial. They just throw him in the first ditch they see. The next thing they'll say is that the Marico Man was found buried with a clay pot next to him and beads. By this time, Gert van Tonder had also tumbled to what was going on. If it was a bit of fun at the schoolmaster's expense, he didn't mind joining in. Frowning at the suggestion of Bushman obsequies in relation to the Marico Man, Gijsbert van Tonder declared he would rather just lie in the veld and be eaten by wild animals than be buried in accordance with the Bushman religion. For one thing, what would my children think of me? I mean, when we meet in the next world, and it comes out that I was buried according to the Bushman religion. Or take the pastor of the Apostolic Church now, that I told to his face how unchristian his Nagmaal service was that I looked in at through the window of his church and saw. I can just imagine how tight the pastor will draw his mouth when he comes across me in the hereafter, with me having been buried under a half moon with an ostrich egg painted blue. I'd feel as though I was walking around with nothing more than a sterk riem on in the hereafter. Not able to keep his face as straight as the Apostolic Church pastors, Gijsbert van Tonder burst out laughing. And so he pretended that he was just laughing at the incongruity of the thought of himself wearing a bushman's wild skin loincloth. "Isn't that a scream?" he asked. "The thought of me wearing a sterk riem in the hiernamaals." When nobody answered, Gijsbert van Tonder's face fell. It seemed to be a bad afternoon for jokes. The only people who appeared to be enjoying themselves were Yuri Steyn and Chris Velman. They kept it up for quite a while, saying silly things about how much discredit the Marico Man was going to bring to the inhabitants of the Dwarsberge area, doing their best to sound earnest. "People all over the world will think we don't even know enough to have an ouderling saying words at the graveside," Yuri Steyn was announcing. "Why all this talk of funerals and the rest?" the schoolmaster interrupted, looking perplexed. "It's not as though the Marico Man died just the other day, after a long and painful illness that he bore with a patience that was an example to the whole of the Dwarsberge. He's got nothing to do with anybody living here now. So I can't understand you talking about him almost as though you're feeling sentimental about him. After all, it's millions of years ago since the Marico Man was on the earth." It was when Yuri Steyn, choking over his words, started to say that was what made it all the more sad, that young Vermaak realized what Yuri Steyn and Chris Velman had been up to. The schoolmaster thought deeply for a few minutes. "Anyway, it's like this," he said eventually. "We know that it can do us a lot of good in these parts to have the Marico Man. He's going to make our district world famous. In radio talks and newspapers, in lectures and theses and textbooks, wherever the Neanderthal man and the Piltdown man get mentioned, the Marico Man will have to be spoken of also. Now that's something, isn't it? Quite a bit of an achievement for a South African, don't you think?" Young Vermaak recognized, however, that a certain element of jealousy crept into these things. Even the world of science was not altogether immune from that regrettable spirit of partisanship which, in the education department, for instance, could lead to a man who had only a third-class teacher's certificate getting appointed to an aide post over the head of somebody who had excellent academic qualifications, failing only in blackboard work. And I still say, young Vermaak declared, speaking, as it were, in parentheses, that give me a piece of chalk that writes and a blackboard easel that doesn't fall over backwards the moment you touch it. The department examiner hopping about directly afterwards, holding his one foot. Then I still say I'm as good at blackboard work as the next man. We felt that it would have been better taste on young Vermaak's part if he had abstained from drawing aside the veil that had, until then, screened from public gaze the circumstances attended on his having got low marks in one of the subjects he took for his teacher's diploma. I'm only trying to explain, he continued, closing in a somewhat self-conscious fashion the parentheses, that in a scientific world there will, as likely as not, be prejudice against the Marico Man. And just because he's so good, that is, they'll have spite against him. And so they won't sometimes mention his name when they ought to. Like when they're mentioning the Neanderthal man's name, say, or the Piltdown man's name. He's great, I'm telling you. The Marico Man is. As a claimant for being the first man, why, the Marico Man has got the Piltdown man licked hollow. And as for the Neanderthal man, I really believe that next to the Marico Man, the Neanderthal man hasn't got a leg to stand on, leave alone 2 legs and 2 hands to stand on, which I believe is how the Marico Man actually stood, if the truth were only known. That's how good I think the Marico Man is. And so you can quite understand that there would be scientists that would be jealous of the Marico Man and that they would speak slightingly of him. They don't have to accept it that their Neanderthal man went up like a rocket but came down like a stick the moment the Marico Man arrived on the scene. Arriving on the scene, walking on all fours even, with his mouth hanging sort of half open in surprise. There are going to be scientists that will hesitate to let on, in fashionable places, that they have even heard of the Marico Man. And all just because they think he's a bit too crude. Everybody naturally expects the first man to have been somewhat rough, but when he's just out and out offensive, like it looks as though the Marico Man must have been, well, you can understand that quite a lot of scientists are going to be pretty haughty in their treatment of him, especially when they've got the future of their pet, the Neanderthal man, to think of, or their other pet, the Piltdown man. His career. Next thing they know, the Piltdown man will be out of a job. He'll be on the sidewalk, caging sixpences for drink. Needless to say, the way the schoolmaster put it then made it all look different. If there was going to be prejudice against the Marico Man, merely because he came from this side of the Dwarsberge, well, we wouldn't stand for it. That was all. I'd like to know what right they've got to despise the Marico Man, Yuri Stein said. Just as long as he did the best he could while he was alive. That's what I say. Just so they can crack up one of those, what are they again? The Neanderthal man? The schoolmaster asked. The Piltdown man? Yes, Yuri Stein said. Those. A couple of foreigners, immigrants, that the Marico Man has got to stand cheek from when he's just as good. The point the schoolmaster said about the Marico Man was not only that he did his best, but that he achieved far more than any of his closest rivals in the competition for being acclaimed the first man. From the shape of his skull, you could see that the Marico Man had all the opposition beaten to a frazzle in respect of weakness of brain pan. The Marico Man was so much slower-witted than the Piltdown man that it was pitiful. Pitiful for the Piltdown man's chances of getting recognized as having been the first man that was. Nobody, no matter how primitive, had any chance of being accorded senior classification as a human being, when all the time there was the Marico Man lurking in the background. Skulking in the background would probably be a more accurate way of expressing it. It was a solemn thought, the schoolmaster said, to contemplate the Marico Man as we knew him. The Marico Man supporting himself in an upright position with the help of his knuckles, his eyebrows lifted high, and his jaw protruding several inches more than the Neanderthal man's jaw. The Marico Man in that particular posture, looking at a planet, it made you think, the schoolmaster said. Gysbert van Tonder was the first to tumble to it, that in all this long thing he was saying, the schoolmaster was just being sarcastic on account of his leg having been pulled earlier on. But I still say, Gysbert van Tonder declared doggedly, with all this nonsense that's been talked, I still say that if Dr. Van Below knows what is good for him, he'll keep away from this part of the Dwarsberge. We won't think twice of running him out of the place. Running him and his precious Marico Man out of the place. And seeing which of them goes quicker. What I can't get over is the cheek of this scientist, digging up a handful of bones and calling them the Marico Man, and talking about him walking almost 4-footed and having a weak brain pan and a jaw like a gorilla, and it's closely reasoned treatise, the schoolmaster said. I've read it. About the only insulting thing, Gysbert van Tonder observed, that this scientist doesn't say about the Marico Man is that the Marico Man is also cross-eyed and left-handed. This was one of those days when Oupa Becker was somewhat more deaf than usual. He had heard and followed only part of the conversation. The first man in the Marico, Oupa Becker asked.
You mean the first Marico white man? Well, that's Lou Combrink. Lou Tokies, we used to call him in the old days. He used to walk sort of bent forward, eh? What's that? No, not his beard. It's the way his jaw stuck out. Lou Tokies. Of course he's still alive. He's living in the mountains, just the other side of Derdepoort. Scientist? Well, I'd like to see what Lou Tokies does to a scientist that's been telling people he's dead. I'd like to see it, that's all.